The tow truck showed up while my wife was being lowered into the ground. Not later that day, not the next morning, but right in the middle of her funeral. And the craziest part is, the people who ordered it actually thought they were just enforcing the rules. They had no idea who they had just picked a fight with. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 42 years old, and until about a year ago, I spent most of my adult life working as a forensic investigator for the Department of Justice. Financial crimes, mostly. Money laundering, procurement fraud, bribery networks, the kind of paper trails that look boring until you start following them and suddenly someone's entire life collapses. I did that for 18 years, which is probably why what happened next unfolded the way it did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up a little. My wife, Claire, had been fighting ovarian cancer for almost a year and a half. It started with what we thought was just stomach pain, something minor, something a doctor would wave away with a prescription and a shrug. Instead, it turned into surgeries, chemo, hospital corridors that smell like antiseptic and burnt coffee, and long nights sitting beside a bed listening to machines breathe for the person you love. Cancer has this strange way of shrinking your world. Bills pile up, paperwork piles up, everyday stuff just quietly stops mattering. Registration renewals, yard maintenance, HOA letters in the mailbox. Those things start to feel like noise in the background of a much bigger fight. Claire had this little silver Subaru Outback she loved. Nothing fancy, but she called it her adventure wagon. We used to drive it up into the mountains on weekends before she got sick. When the treatments started getting rough, the car mostly stayed parked in our driveway. Sometime during those months, the registration expired. I knew it. I just didn't care enough to deal with it right then. My priorities were a little different. Our neighborhood sat inside one of those suburban homeowners associations. Nice lawns, tidy mailboxes, people who take pictures of your trash cans if they're visible from the street. You probably know the type. Most of the time I ignored them. They sent letters about weeds and fence stains and basketball hoops left in driveways. I tossed most of those envelopes into a kitchen drawer without opening them. Claire used to joke about it. "Danny," she'd say, smiling that tired smile she had near the end. "One day the HOA is going to come for you." I'd laugh and tell her they'd have to catch me first. Turns out, she wasn't entirely wrong. The funeral was on a Thursday afternoon. Gray sky, cool breeze, the kind of quiet day where everything feels muted. Friends from Claire's nursing job showed up, neighbors came by, even a few old colleagues of mine drove in from out of state. It was one of those heavy gatherings where people hug you a little too long because nobody really knows what to say. I remember standing beside the casket, staring at the ground while the pastor talked about courage and grace and eternal rest. Words floated past me, but didn't really land anywhere. About halfway through the service, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I ignored it. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. And again. When the ceremony finished and people started drifting away, I finally checked it. 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. And 1 voicemail. I played it while standing beside my car in the cemetery parking lot. A woman's voice, flat and professional. "Hello, this is Megan Carter from Pine Ridge Community Compliance Office. We're calling regarding a vehicle violation at your property. A silver Subaru has been removed due to extended parking without valid registration under Section 7.2 of the HOA agreement. Retrieval fee is $495. Please contact Dalton Recovery Services within 30 days before the vehicle is processed for lien sale." I listened to that message twice, then a third time. At first I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. So I drove home. The house felt painfully quiet without Claire in it. I walked through the front door, set my keys on the counter, and looked out the kitchen window. The driveway was empty. That's when the reality of it landed. My wife's car had been towed. While we were burying her, I stood there for a long moment, just staring at that empty patch of concrete, like maybe the car would somehow reappear if I waited long enough. Then I picked up the phone and called the number in the voicemail. A woman answered on the second ring. "Pine Ridge Compliance." "Yeah," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Daniel Harper. I just got a message about a vehicle tow at my address." A pause. Keyboard clicking. "Yes, Mr. Harper," she said. "The Subaru Outback. It had expired registration and had been stationary for more than 72 hours. I took a breath. "My wife passed away," I said. "Today was her funeral. That's why the car hasn't moved." Another pause. For a second, I almost thought maybe she'd soften, maybe apologize. Instead, she said something I'll never forget. Mr. Harper, the rules apply equally to everyone. Personal circumstances don't create exceptions. I leaned against the kitchen counter and stared at the floor. So you towed it during the funeral. That's when the vehicle was accessible, she replied. Her tone was calm, almost bored. And the fee is $495? Yes, payable to Dalton Recovery. I could feel something shifting inside my chest, something cold and focused. Years ago, when I worked investigations, we used to talk about a moment called the switch. It's when emotion shuts off and your brain quietly starts cataloging details. I felt that switch flip. All right, I said. That's fine. There was another pause. You're not disputing the violation? She asked. No, I replied calmly. I understand the rules. And technically I did. What she didn't understand was that the moment she said those words, I had already started looking at this whole situation the way an investigator would. And something about it didn't sit right. Because in 18 years of chasing fraud, I had learned one thing. When people enforce rules with that much enthusiasm, sometimes it's because the rules are making them money. That night the house felt wrong in a way that's hard to explain. When someone dies, the silence they leave behind has weight to it. Every room echoes differently. The couch where they used to sit feels like a museum exhibit. Even the refrigerator humming in the kitchen sounds louder. I made a cup of coffee I didn't really want and sat down at the dining table with my laptop. I told myself I was just going to look at the paperwork. Nothing dramatic, just curiosity. But old habits don't really disappear. They sit dormant until something wakes them up. And that phone call had definitely woken something up. The first thing I did was pull up the HOA bylaws. Pine Ridge Community Association had a website with a member portal where all the rules and contracts lived. I'd never logged in before. Claire used to handle that kind of stuff. Password reset, quick verification email. 2 minutes later I was in. The vehicle enforcement section was exactly what Megan Carter had quoted. Section 7.2. Unregistered vehicles parked more than 72 hours were subject to removal. Fine. But what caught my eye wasn't the rule. It was the towing contractor listed underneath it. Dalton Recovery Services. I'd seen that name in the voicemail. So I clicked the contract attachment. Now here's the thing most people don't realize about contracts between HOAs and service vendors. They're supposed to go through a bidding process. Landscaping, trash collection, towing, security patrols. The board is supposed to solicit multiple bids and pick the best one for residents. That process leaves paperwork, and paperwork leaves fingerprints. The Pine Ridge contract file contained exactly one document. 1. No bid comparison sheet. No proposal summaries. No board vote minutes attached. Just a 3-page agreement awarding Dalton Recovery exclusive towing rights for the entire neighborhood. That's unusual. Not illegal on its own, but unusual. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of coffee. The switch in my brain clicked a little louder. So I looked up Dalton Recovery. The company was owned by a guy named Travis Dalton. Mid-40s, according to public records. Small operation across town. 2 tow trucks, maybe 3. Their website was, let's call it minimal. No pricing sheet. That was the second thing that made my eyebrow go up. Most towing companies are required to publish fee schedules if they work with residential communities. So I pulled up the county ordinance database and found the approved towing rate chart. Standard non-consensual tow from private property, $145. Storage, $35 per day. Administrative processing, $25. I did some quick math on a scrap of paper. Then I looked back at the voicemail. $495. That's not a small difference. That's more than triple. Now again, technically companies can charge different rates if the HOA contract allows it, but it's rare. HOAs usually negotiate lower prices for residents, not higher. So now my curiosity had turned into something closer to suspicion. And suspicion is basically gasoline for a guy with my background. I opened another browser tab and searched Travis Dalton in the state business registry. His company had been operating for about 2 years, which lined up almost perfectly with the date on the HOA contract. Interesting coincidence. I checked property records next. Dalton owned a small yard outside the city limits where the trucks were parked. Then I checked civil filings. 3 small claims lawsuits from residents in other neighborhoods complaining about excessive towing fees. 2 had been settled. 1 dismissed. Still a pattern. By midnight, my dining table looked like the early stage of an investigation board. Laptop open, notes scribbled everywhere, county ordinance PDFs scattered across the screen. And something about the numbers kept bothering me. Towing companies don't usually charge triple the county rate unless someone lets them or encourages them. That's when I decided to look at something most people never think about: the HOA financial disclosures. Homeowners associations have to publish basic financial statements for residents: budgets, vendor payments, operational expenses. I found the most recent report and scrolled through the expense categories: landscaping, snow removal, pool maintenance, security patrol. Then near the bottom, enforcement services. And there it was: Dalton Recovery Services. Paid administrative coordination fees. That phrase made me stop. Towing companies don't normally get paid administrative coordination fees. Residents pay them directly when their vehicles are towed. So why was the HOA paying Dalton money too? I opened the detailed ledger. 6 payments in the past year, each for $2,000. $12,000 total. Now that was strange, because it meant Dalton was making money from both sides of the system. Residents paid towing fees, and the HOA paid him additional money, which meant either this was a very unusual contract, or someone had created a very profitable little arrangement. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. Part of me wanted to stop right there. Claire had just been buried. Normal people would have gone to bed, grieved, watched bad TV until exhaustion took over. But grief does strange things to your mind. It gives you long, quiet hours with nothing to distract you. And in those quiet hours, puzzles start pulling at you. By the next morning, I was fully awake before sunrise. Coffee in hand, laptop open again. This time I decided to check something a little more specific: tow authorizations. Whenever a car is removed from private property, someone has to authorize it. Usually a property manager or compliance officer signs a digital form or logs the violation in a database. Those records are supposed to be stored. Pine Ridge had a violation portal. Residents could see notices issued against their properties. I clicked the search filter and typed vehicle tow. 37 results popped up over the last 18 months. 37. That's a lot for a neighborhood our size. I opened the first one. Same template Megan used on me. Unregistered vehicle. 72-hour violation. Tow ordered by compliance officer Megan Carter. Second record. Same wording. Third. Same again. Almost copy-paste. I started a spreadsheet and entered every case. Vehicle. Date. Fee. Tow company. By the time I finished, a pattern was forming. The vast majority of tows happened on weekday afternoons, usually between 2 and 4 p.m., which struck me as odd. Because if the violation was 72 hours, why were they always being enforced in the same narrow window? I stared at the spreadsheet for a while. Then another old instinct kicked in. Follow the money. I opened the state campaign finance database. Why? Because people involved in local contracts sometimes donate to board members or officials. I searched the name Travis Dalton, and there it was. 3 donations. Small ones, but interesting. Each $250. All made to something called the Pine Ridge Community Improvement Committee. That committee, it turned out, was run by Megan Carter. Technically, it wasn't illegal, but the timing was interesting. Every donation landed within a week of the HOA renewing Dalton's contract. Now my investigator brain was fully awake. I spent the next few hours digging deeper. Public bank records aren't available without subpoenas, but court filings sometimes reference them. One of those small claims lawsuits included an exhibit, a screenshot from Dalton's business account. That screenshot showed a withdrawal labeled admin payout. $300. Cash. Made the same day as a vehicle tow. My fingers stopped on the keyboard. 300. That number stuck with me. So I pulled up the HOA tow log again. 37 vehicles. If someone was getting $300 per tow, that's over $11,000. Just in what looked suspiciously like kickbacks. I sat there in silence for a long time. Claire used to say I had a certain look when I figured something out. A quiet kind of focus that meant someone, somewhere, was about to have a bad week. If she had walked into the kitchen that morning, she would have recognized that look immediately. Because at that point I wasn't just curious anymore. I was building a case. And the thing about building cases is, once you start, it's hard to stop. Over the next 4 days, I treated the situation exactly like one of my old investigations. Public records requests, property filings, court archives, even a few phone calls to residents whose cars had been towed. One guy named Miguel told me his truck had been taken while he was on a business trip. Another woman said she never even received the warning notice before her car disappeared. Little pieces. Tiny cracks in the story. But when you line up enough cracks, the whole wall eventually comes down. By the end of day 6, I had a document on my laptop that was 89 pages long. Bank timelines, contract irregularities, tow patterns, fee comparisons with county limits, all organized neatly into sections. The kind of report investigators love, and the kind people committing fraud absolutely hate. I saved the file, sat back in my chair, and looked at Claire's photo sitting on the shelf across the room. "You always said the HOA would come for me," I muttered. Then I closed the laptop, because the next step was sending that report somewhere that could actually do something with it. I didn't send that report right away. I sat with it for almost a full day. Part of it was grief. Part of it was hesitation. Because once you press send on something like that, you're not just filing a complaint, you're lighting a fuse. And I knew exactly how those fuses tend to burn. The next morning, I made one small change to the document. Added a cover page, tightened a few sections, attached the supporting files. Then I uploaded the whole package through the State Attorney General's fraud reporting portal. 89 pages. Contracts, spreadsheets, timelines, screenshots, public records. It took maybe 2 minutes. Then the screen said, "Submission received." That was it. No dramatic music. No flashing lights. Just a quiet confirmation number and an automated email. I shut the laptop and figured maybe someday someone would look at it. In my old job, we used to joke that government investigations move slower than glaciers. I expected this one to sit in a queue for months. Turns out, I was wrong. 10 days later, my phone rang. The caller ID said State Investigator. I stepped outside onto the back patio to take it. "Mr. Harper?" a man said. "Yes. This is Thomas Keegan with the State Financial Crimes Division. I'm calling about the documentation you submitted regarding Pine Ridge Community Association." His voice had that tone investigators get when they're trying not to sound impressed. "You wrote that report?" he asked. "I did." There was a small pause. "Well," he said, "it's extremely thorough." I leaned against the railing and looked out across the quiet backyard. "What happens next?" I asked. Another pause. "We're opening an inquiry." That was the moment the fuse started burning. The next 3 weeks were interesting. Investigators contacted residents whose vehicles had been towed. They requested financial records from the HOA. They subpoenaed Dalton Recovery's bank accounts. And the more they looked, the worse it got. A lot worse. Turns out the little pattern I noticed was just the tip of the iceberg. Dalton Recovery hadn't just been towing cars with inflated fees. They had been forging authorization signatures on dozens of tow forms. 67 vehicles, according to the final count. That meant cars were being taken even when proper HOA approval hadn't actually happened. Then there were the administrative charges. Residents had been billed extra processing fees that weren't allowed under county regulations. $31,000 worth of them. And the auction issue. That one surprised even me. 14 vehicles had been sold through lien auctions without the legally required notification letters ever being sent. Each one of those violations carried a potential $10,000 penalty under state law. When Investigator Keegan called again to update me, his voice sounded very different from the first conversation. "Mr. Harper," he said, "this thing is bigger than we expected." I remember standing in the grocery store parking lot when he said that. "How big?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "Let's just say your report started something." 22 days after the investigation officially opened, the state issued an emergency order shutting down Dalton Recovery Services. Tow trucks seized. Business license revoked. Travis Dalton himself was arrested on charges including fraud, racketeering, and theft. The news hit the neighborhood like a lightning strike. People who had been quietly irritated about towing fees suddenly realized the whole system had been corrupt. And once that realization spreads, it moves fast. Within a week, a group of residents hired an attorney. Then another group joined. Eventually, 67 vehicle owners signed onto a class action lawsuit. Their demand was simple: refund everything, plus damages. The total claim came out to $680,000. The HOA board held an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. I didn't attend, but my neighbor Carl did, and he called me afterward. "Man," he said, half laughing, half shocked, "you should have seen their faces." Apparently, the board members looked like people who had just discovered their house was on fire. The compliance officer, Megan Carter, was suspended immediately. 2 days later, she was arrested for accepting illegal kickbacks. Remember those $300 withdrawals? Investigators traced $47,000 in payments from Dalton's business account over 19 months. Cash transfers, every single one tied to a tow authorization. Turns out the enthusiastic rule enforcement had a pretty strong financial incentive behind it. The legal fallout kept growing. Dalton declared bankruptcy within months. His company had been making around $300,000 a year, but the penalties and lawsuits buried him. Last I heard, he took a night shift warehouse job outside the city. $16 and change an hour. As for Megan Carter, the woman who told me, personal circumstances don't create exceptions. She lost her job. Her house went into foreclosure during the civil case, and prosecutors offered her a plea deal carrying up to 7 years. I didn't celebrate that outcome. Honestly, watching people's lives implode isn't as satisfying as movies make it look. Mostly it just feels heavy. The HOA itself didn't escape the damage either. Their insurance covered part of the settlement, but not all of it. They established a victim compensation fund of $125,000. The remaining $480,000 had to be collected through a special assessment. $10,400 per homeowner. When Carl told me that number, I nearly dropped my coffee. That's insane, I said. Yeah, he replied quietly. 17 families couldn't pay it. They're already talking foreclosure. That part stuck with me, because the original problem started with rules being enforced without compassion. And somehow the consequences ended up hurting a lot of people who had nothing to do with the corruption. A few months after everything settled down, I got a call from the HOA's attorney. They wanted to return Claire's Subaru. I drove out to the impound yard to pick it up. It looked exactly the way we left it. Same dusty windshield, same little pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror. The clerk handed me the keys along with an envelope. Inside was a formal apology letter and a settlement check for $18,000. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. Claire used to sing along to the radio in that car. Loud, off-key, completely unapologetic. For a second I could almost hear her again. Then the moment passed. I drove home slowly, parked the Subaru back in the driveway where it belonged, and shut the engine off. The concrete looked exactly the same as it had that afternoon when I found it empty. Except now, everything around it had changed. Sometimes people ask me if the whole thing was worth it, if exposing the corruption brought any kind of closure. The honest answer is, I don't know. Justice happened, technically. The fraud stopped. The people responsible were punished. But the neighborhood still carries the scars of it. Families lost homes. Friendships broke. And every time I look at that driveway, I remember the day my wife was buried, and how a tow truck driver decided that was the right moment to enforce a rule. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have gone digging the way I did? Or would you have just paid the fee, picked up the car, and tried to move on? And what about the HOA itself? Were they victims of one corrupt employee? Or should the entire community leadership be held responsible for letting something like that happen in the first place? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Drop your opinion in the comments, because stories like this always seem simple at first, until you start asking where accountability actually begins and where it should end.